Now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Brian Garreau, the Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Academic Planning and a Professor of Sociology and International Studies, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Maddie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see a full room to hear Professor Coleman talk about his ongoing research. Professor Coleman is an Associate Professor of History at the University of Toronto. His research and teaching focus on the histories of capitalism, photography, and Catholicism in 20th century Latin America. He is the writer and director of Stolen Photo, a documentary film co-produced by Señal Colombia and supported by the National Film Board of Canada. He is also the author of A Camera in the Garden of Eden, The Self-Forging of a Banana Republic, published by University of Texas Press. He is co-editor of Capitalism and the Camera, published by Verso Press, and Coup d'etat in Cold War Latin America, 1964 to 1982, published by Cambridge University Press. His articles have been published in leading journals, including Hispanic American Historical Review, the Radical History Review, and Photography and Culture. His research has been funded by the American Council of Learned Societies, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Fulbright Hays Program, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. His research and teaching have been awarded prizes from the American Historical Association and the Canadian Historical Association. Kevin received his PhD from Indiana University, his MA from the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and his BA from Northern Arizona University. Kevin also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras from 1997 to 1999, and that is where we met and became good friends. There's some fellow Peace Corps volunteers in the room with us today. Before turning things over to Professor Coleman, let me thank the people who made his visit possible. We're grateful to the sponsorship and support of the Institute for the Liberal Arts and its director, Professor Mary Crane, the Jesuit Institute and its director, Father Jim Keenan, the Boston College Libraries, the Boise Center. I can't believe I said Boise Center. I know better than that. The Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life and its director, Father Mark Massa. Special thanks as well to Father Greg Kalcher, the Dean of the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences, and a very special thank you to Tony Ross, Susie Richard, and Maddie Jarrett for their excellent organizing and planning. In Kevin's book project, The Afterlives of Óscar Romero, Kevin writes that Father Romero had, quote, mastered techniques of organizing his inner life to courageously work for the common good in a hostile world. That's worth repeating. Romero had mastered techniques of organizing his inner life to courageously work for the common good in a hostile world. Having known Kevin for close to 30 years, I suspect that this is a mastery Kevin himself aspires to. And I suspect that, after hearing his talk, you'll agree that he is closer to achieving it with grace, humility, and ethical clarity than he might even realize. Please join me in welcoming Professor Coleman.
So thank you, everyone, for coming out. Thank you, especially Brian, and for organizing and for your friendship over the years. Some of us haven't been in the same room in 30 years. So it's really neat. And thank you to all of you. I want to get right to it, and we'll have time to talk afterwards. Okay. And to Madeline for all the organizational work behind the scenes. The paper that I'll give today attempts to summarize the contributions of a book that I'm calling The Afterlives of Óscar Romero. Because I'd like for the book to reach a general audience, I've focused on keeping the narrative moving and have left out the scholarly argumentation. So for the next 45 minutes, I'd like to try and make explicit some of the claims that are implicit in the manuscript. My central argument is that Romero's prophetic stance as Archbishop of San Salvador necessitated a fight on theological terrain. That is, those whose actions he was denouncing could not limit their responses to the spheres of politics, society, or law. They had to respond in the register of God talk. Second, in following from my first argument, I developed theopolitics not as a testimony of faith, nor as a normative or constructive proposal for building the world as it should be, but as a category of analysis that historians need to use if we want to understand paths in which religion and politics have been fused. Late Cold War El Salvador and our contemporary moment are two such instances, when thinking through the lens of theopolitics can be illuminating. Third, I developed the concept of theopolitical doppelgängers, as well as a set of related concepts, to describe a mirroring between religious actors who claim the same faith, but take that faith to authorize very different visions of political life. Fourth, I convert the cause for the canonization of Romero into an object of study, tracking how each of these dynamics crystallized in the contest over the meaning of Romero's life, death, and legacy. Hay dos monseñores Romero en la misma persona, un hombre a quien yo aprecié por sus cualidades y virtudes personales, pero también un hombre que se dejó manipular. There were two Romeros in the same person, Bishop René Revello testified. There was the man who I appreciated for his personal qualities and virtues, but there was also the man who allowed himself to be manipulated. This testimony comes from documents produced for the beatification and canonization of Archbishop Romero. Decades after Romero was shot on the altar while saying Mass in El Salvador in March 1980, Bishop Revello theologically transformed political disagreement into heresy. The distinction he made between authentic and manipulated religious authority was the theological kernel that enabled Christians to accept, and in some cases sanction, the killing of other Christians. The Romero that millions remember and regard as a martyr, Bishop Revello suggested, was really his double, an impure, subversive, contaminating the church from within. In this project, I developed the concept of theopolitical doppelgängers to explain how competing Christian traditions create theological doubles that appear structurally similar but authorize opposite actions. Bishop Revello was himself a mirror image of Romero. Within Catholic theology, they were both considered vicars of Christ. The Latin word vicarius, I can't pronounce Latin, but we can Spanishise it, means in place of, and both Revello and Romero were consecrated as visible representatives of Christ, as all Christians are called to be. The core mechanism of theological splitting that Revello's testimony reveals between the authentic and the manipulated Romero operates not only through the documents of canonization, but through the public attacks made on Romero during the last 3 years of his life, which you guys will soon see is documented quite extensively. You have the archives here at Boston College. And eventually. Sorry, Seth. Sorry, Seth. Oh, God. Delete that.
Cut it out.
Delete that, Maddie.
It's okay.
See what you're doing? You get me, invite me here.
Work in progress.
No, it's a good thing. And it's in the documents extensively. More troubling, in the decades before he became the leading defender of human rights in the late 1970s, Romero himself made similar attacks on the Jesuits and other committed Catholics whose faith led them to accompany the poor and dispossessed. Thus, in a sense, the attacks he made on others in 1973, he accused the Jesuits of being demagogic pedagogues of a false liberating education, rebounded back on him. The logic of theopolitical doppelgängers is thus a martyr-making machine, as the struggle to define the pure and impure propels both a repeated splitting within the same faith community and a mimetic drive to become like the ones held up as worthy of imitation. In an incisive inquiry into the hall of mirrors that is warping our politics and our relationships, the journalist Naomi Klein notes that the Austrian psychoanalyst Otto Rank saw the soul as the original doppelganger, the most intimate of doubles. Belief in a soul was a defense mechanism, a way to avoid the dread of death. Sigmund Freud agreed, writing that the immortal soul was the first double of the body. The conscience itself, Freud argued, was a form of internal doubling, a special faculty developed to keep the ego in check, whose function was to observe and criticize the self, quote, exercising a censorship within the mind. Our fear of death prompts us to invent another kind of double, the uncanny person, the evil twin. Quote, we must not only credit him with bad intentions, Freud wrote, but must attribute to these intentions a capacity to achieve their aim in virtue of certain special powers, end quote. As Klein winds down her exploration of capitalism's mirror worlds, she clears a path toward solidarity. But doppelgängers, she writes, by messing with our heads and our illusions of sovereignty, can help teach us this lesson, that we're not as separate from one another as we think. A woodcut hanging in the front office of the Romero House on Bloor Street in Toronto reminds me that Óscar Romero is now an icon of solidarity. For 35 years, the spirit of Romero has inspired hundreds of volunteers to welcome refugees from Ecuador, Colombia, Syria, Uganda, Afghanistan, Bangladesh into their neighborhoods. This is the enduring paradox of Romero. He is a saint whose sainthood was vehemently opposed on theological grounds, yet he continues to move people to work for justice in their own communities around the world. With the term theopolitical doppelgängers, I'm trying to identify the structural and substantive similarity between ultra-conservative Christianity and its liberationist counterpart. They both claim the same origins, they both claim access to a pure tradition that they seek to recover, one from the Middle Ages and another from ancient Christianity. They cite the same texts, yet they develop opposing political valences in their appeals to sacred legitimation. The two feed off each other, fueling a dynamic that accelerates. In El Salvador, the same Christian formation produced a militarized Catholicism entwined with the national security doctrine, and liberation theology, which saw some committed Catholics lose hope in nonviolent political struggle and take up arms against an entrenched military dictatorship. This is the doubling seen in Revelo's two Romeros, a contradictory split in the same person. At stake was the meaning of Romero's life and death. Was he killed for political reasons, or in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith? My source material reveals that in the very moments when this logic of splitting threatens to be transcended, ordinary political arguments and accusations, the epithets of communist and subversive, became inadequate, and the theological must be called upon. At that moment, God and Satan, the doppelgängers, become indispensable in earthbound intra-Christian struggles. Such moments can be seen during the last 3 years of Romero's life. As Romero used his institutional authority as Archbishop to defend the very Jesuits that he had previously attacked, to hold the military government that he had long supported to account for its acts of state terrorism, the assaults on his authority as Archbishop by his fellow bishops and lay Catholics, as well as by Catholic civil society organizations and business consortiums, were increasingly made on theological grounds. In my book manuscript, I'm attempting to make the past and present collide, to use archival materials to illuminate contemporary struggles in which those calling for violence project that call onto others they deem political enemies, thereby legitimating an authoritarian crackdown. But I also use my material to show how this logic of doubling can be arrested and then redirected to counteract deception and violence, and then be converted into a memory that can be drawn upon to expand human freedom and solidarity. Romero's assassination and the decades-long contest over his legacy illuminate a broader pattern of theological warfare that extends from the colonial conquest of the Americas to current battles over Christian political theologies in the age of Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, and Nayib Bukele. My basic question is this: what motivates believers who kill believers in the name of the same God? I'm not the first to ask this question. In an important study of Argentina during the dictatorship of 1976 to 1983, your colleague here, Gustavo Morello, asked, quote, how did the military Catholic dictatorship justify torturing Catholic seminarians? What were the bishop's reactions to the persecution of these religious workers? What did it mean to be Catholic at that time and in that place? To answer these questions, Morello identified three types of Catholic faithful in Argentina during the dictatorship: anti-secular, institutional, and committed Catholics. He defined Catholics who staunchly resisted accommodating to the changes provoked by modernity as anti-secular. The second type, which he called institutional Catholics, were concerned about their religion with the government and their responsibilities as political actors in the fragile Argentine social order. They focused on maintaining the church's autonomy and often sought to be neutral mediators with the state while averting a direct confrontation. But from the perspective of victims of state terror, institutional Catholics were complicit in the human rights violations. The third type that Morello identifies, committed Catholics, were victimized, he concludes, because of their religious convictions, which had pushed them to be closer to the poor. Like Romero, many Argentine Catholics were theologically conservative and politically nationalistic. Unlike them, Romero came to argue for the increased participation of the Salvadoran masses in politics. He came to see social democracy and a functioning judicial system as the best means for guaranteeing rights. So quickly, the Argentine bishops, Argentina didn't have an equivalent. Most of the Argentine bishops did not come out in the way that Romero came out and denounced the dictatorship. They, as we know from Francis's story, did other things behind the scenes, but it was different. But for 60 years, Romero publicly oscillated between being, to use Morello's terms, an anti-secular and an institutional Catholic. Only during the last 3 years of his life did Romero publicly bridge these categories, demonstrating that institutional authority could be mobilized in defense of the poor and persecuted. So I call this Romero's institutional prophetic synthesis, and the authoritarian regime recognized it as an unprecedented challenge to its rule. As Archbishop, Romero used the weight and authority of his position to witness to human rights violations and to articulate a vision for a more just society. A delegate of the word in a base community could be ignored. An archbishop could not. In response, the far right needed not only guns, but theological counter-proposals. I've outlined above why I'm using the term doppelgängers to explain what I see as a doubling within Christianity between traditionalists and liberationists during the late Cold War. Now I'd like to outline what I mean by theopolitics. To ask the question again, how did people of the same faith justify violence against each other? They, after all, drew on the same text and referred to the same tradition to claim divine sanction for killing the other, to save what they saw as the true faith. I'm experimenting with a fancy term, theopolitical authorization, to try to understand this phenomenon and use it to explain how political actors in late Cold War El Salvador went beyond the political ideological and tapped into theological reasoning to justify violence against their fellow Christians. That is, they went beyond the sort of standard anti-communism thing. I come to this term because I haven't found a better one, although I've been looking, searching for a concept that could help me make sense of my source material on Romero. I found myself moving through key works of political theology, the history of Catholicism, and more recent work by anthropologists. Carl Schmitt's theory of how the modern state and its sovereign instantiate the secularization of theological ideas was unavoidable, historian Robert Orsi's notion of real presence as, quote, not necessarily good, not necessarily bad, and it is rarely either good or bad, end quote, has helped me understand how the gods remain active in the lives of the faithful. Theologian William Cavanaugh's treatise on the uses of idolatry offers insights that help me make sense of Romero's call to overthrow the false idols of wealth and power. Those are Romero's terms, false idols. But what Romero said next gives me pause. Quote, this is Romero in 79, just as when the first evangelizers in the Americas overthrew the false gods our indigenous peoples were worshiping, end quote. In the context of the Americas, I'm not sure that Christianity can ever be cleaved from its colonial history, as Romero's preaching from 1979 unfortunately reminds us. And that's my concern as well with Cavanaugh's account of idolatry. In assuming a pure tradition that can be recovered over and against its idolatrous distortions, I worry that we'll get trapped in the very antagonistic logic that I'm trying to understand. I then turn from these works to recent theorizing by anthropologists Carlota McAllister and Valentina Napolitano of what they call theopolitics. They describe, quote, a sovereignty from below characterized by vulnerability and openness to an ever-provisional messianic force that partakes in history, end quote. Their notion of theopolitics enables us to account for divine alterity in colonial history. But I worry that their notion of theopolitics risks becoming the liberationist flip side of Schmittian authoritarianism. A politics from below can become as authoritarian as a politics from above. No tradition, or for that matter, no social position, is pure. As I read the various strands in the field of political theology, I worry that each rests on certain normative claims, on certain visions of the world, not as it is, but as it should be. This is a noble enterprise, one that should be pursued by theologians, philosophers, ethicists. But I'm not. I'm a historian. And so I think my job is to try to understand what happened in the past and not what I would have liked to have happened. So I offer this concept of theopolitical authorization to capture how competing claims to divine sanction have functioned across confessional boundaries and political persuasions. I see it as a category for understanding how religious and political beliefs impinge on, fuel, and shape each other. This concept helps me make sense of what I'm finding in my sources. Catholic bishops denouncing Romero as a communist dupe. Lay Catholics systematically attacking Romero in the press. Military officers claiming divine mandate for counterinsurgency. And versions of Christianity that alternatively imagined a once glorious past of hierarchy, patriarchy, and medieval costumes, or that of an ancient anti-colonial messiah. In late Cold War El Salvador, I think we can see how political actors used theological claims to justify violence, and in turn invoked a supernatural validation for their positions. With this set of questions and concepts in mind, let's take a closer look at the contest over the meaning of the life and legacy of Óscar Romero. The question that the postulators for Romero's cause had to answer was this: was he killed for political reasons or for his faith? The question was at once historical, political, and theological. The postulators had to grapple with the fact that Romero was killed in a Catholic country by baptized Catholics, who were part of a large conservative movement claiming to defend the country and Christianity itself from a Marxist threat. In doing so, they needed the empirical and interpretive research, that is, the postulators for the cause, needed the empirical and interpretive research of both historians and theologians. This distinction between authentic and inauthentic religious authority was one that Romero himself made at various points as a priest, and especially as auxiliary bishop. He often took it upon himself to patrol the boundaries of Catholic orthodoxy, but privately he was tormented, plagued by an excessive scrupulosity that led him to rigorous self-examination. I think the process of transformation that he underwent, and which took more than a decade to reach public fruition, began in 1966, when he wrote in firm, quick cursive, quote, "A profound review of my life for my confession offers me the lamentable spectacle of ruins and ruins of time lost, 1945 to 1966, end quote. His entire priesthood up to that point he declared wasted. So picture this. Auxiliary Bishop Óscar Romero is sitting at his desk in the office of the Archdiocese of San Salvador. He types "liberating education." The next day, his editorial is published in Orientación, the newspaper of the Archdiocese. It sets off a firestorm that places the Jesuits who ran a local school in the crosshairs. "We," Romero wrote, "are not in agreement with the demagogy of certain pedagogues of a false liberating education." In the weeks before, some parents who sent their children to the Jesuit-run high school accused the teachers of brainwashing their sons. The problem, the parents claimed, was particularly bad in the sociology classes, in which teachers were taking students out into the slums around San Salvador to study the realities of their own society. Romero imprudently sided with the parents. He began his editorial by referencing the guidance issued by the Conference of Latin American Bishops in 1968 in Medellin. Educational methods in the region, the bishops observed, and this is Romero quoting them, had become too abstract and formalist, more passive than discovering, more preoccupied with imparting knowledge than in creating a critical spirit. The bishops of the subcontinent envisioned a new approach, a liberating education capable of liberating our people from the cultural, social, economic, and political servitude that impedes our development. Auxiliary Bishop Romero agreed, but he felt a liberatory education should be oriented toward perfecting, quote, "the innate generosity and restlessness of our youth, rather than demagogy and Marxism." He noted parenthetically, quote, "We don't use this word casually and to startle. The very pamphlets and literature of known red origin distributed in a certain school inspire us to use this word," end quote. That word, Marxism, had long been used in El Salvador to mark ideological enemies for elimination. Now it was the linchpin in a speech act delivered by an ecclesial we. Then Romero delivered the coup de grace. Quote, "May they honorably stop calling themselves Christians because they are breaking the church from within," end quote. This was an act of theological violence. Romero wasn't simply disagreeing with Jesuit pedagogy. He was stripping them of their identity, symbolically setting these learned priests outside the Catholic fold. In doing so, he gave them a different identity, that of false Christians, priests who had been transfigured by their ordination into agents who could speak in the person of Christ, in persona Christi, but who, through their politics, had lost, in Romero's view, the right to call themselves Christians. Auxiliary Bishop Romero's editorial amplified the moral panic of the conservative parents and ignited a firestorm against the Jesuit school. 4 days after his piece was published, the Department of Justice's Criminal Division was investigating whether the teachers had a Marxist-Leninist orientation. The president of the Parents Association of the Externado testified that the students are being submitted to political indoctrination against democracy. Ironic, because there's a military dictatorship. 3 other parents testified that Marxist teachers were brainwashing students and exalting the communist movement of 1932. The Attorney General summoned several Jesuits to testify. Quote, "I bring before this tribunal my deposition in which I attest to the Jesuit priest's plans for anarchy and social ruin," end quote. A prominent newspaper quoted one Dr. Jose Ortiz as saying in a large meeting in the school's chapel. Each parent clearly presented the charges against the Jesuits as indoctrinators of unsuspecting youth, the newspaper reported. Dr. Ortiz recommended the immediate expulsion of Marxist instructors. 11 years would pass before Romero's internal transformation would transform El Salvador's public sphere. As many of you know, just 19 days after Romero was consecrated as Archbishop of San Salvador, Rutilio Grande, Jesuit priest, was gunned down with Manuel Solorzano, an old man, Nelson Rutilio Lemus, a boy. At the Requiem Mass at the Cathedral of San Salvador, with the 3 dead bodies present before the congregation, Romero stood before the papal nuncio and proclaimed, quote, "The Church cannot be absent from this struggle for liberation. Its presence in this struggle to lift up and dignify human beings must be a very original message, a very unique way of being present that the world may not understand, but that provides the seed and the promise of victory and success." End quote. Although Romero had been gradually changing for more than a decade, both the Jesuits who he had branded as Marxist demagogues and the conservative oligarchs who had backed his unexpected appointment as Archbishop were surprised by his willingness to confront the military government. Romero's shift from being regarded as a churchman who was often abrasively anti-secular and institutional to speaking up on behalf of the sector of the church that was being persecuted was met with fierce opposition from El Salvador's far right. Business groups and Catholic traditionalists initiated a campaign of character assassination and delegitimization, branding Romero a communist and subversive. The Agricultural Front of the Eastern Region, FARO, a business association representing many of the country's wealthiest ranchers and plantation owners, presented itself as a defender of Christianity. In a paid spot, FARO used all capital letters, we're now familiar with all capital letters, to make its point. What Jesus Christ understood by his church was his word, his doctrine, his religion. In accordance with the simple beauty and greatness of the thought of Jesus Christ. This is all a quote from Fado. You can't read it up there. I just give you some examples of it. But listen to this. This is Fado attacking the Archbishop and the liberationist priests. What Jesus Christ understood by his church, all caps, his word, his doctrine, his religion, in accordance with the simple beauty and greatness of the thought of Jesus Christ, the apostles and their successors, who make up today's clergy, are not the church. They are not the religion. To affirm that one or several archbishops or bishops or priests are the religion, are the church, as the hierarchy and clergy do, is nothing but an expression of arrogance and repugnant, absurd, monstrous self-deification. End quote. The business association inverted the old accusation of idolatry. The idolaters, according to Fado, were the self-deifying archbishop and the Jesuits. A widely circulated flyer in 1977 shouted in all caps, "Monsignor Romero is imprisoned within a tight circle of third world priests led by Monsignor Rivera. This group manipulates a radio that spreads its ideas and violent groups that commit outrages in the name of the gospel. In our view, the small group manipulating the church does not represent it. That group lost its moral and divine authority the moment its members made themselves into politicians and fronts for Marxist and violent organizations like the FPL, ERP, FECAS, UTC, and the rest of the popular revolutionary bloc that is bloodying the country." End quote. In 1978, the Jesuits defended Romero in radio, in the diocesan radio station. Aminta Amaya, a lay Catholic newspaper columnist, had again accused the Archbishop of placing, quote, "Marxist interests against an apparently defenseless homeland," end quote. The Jesuits respond, behind the pretext of attacking communism, many are working to consolidate all forms of injustice and totalitarianism. Conservative Catholics, as we see in these examples, claimed divine sanctioned to effectively brand Romero a heretic and not merely a political opponent. By casting Romero's theologically grounded solidarity with the poor as satanic, an attempt on his life could become a sacred duty. The extended timeline we explored here, from Romero's spiritual retreat in 1966 to his attacks on the Jesuits in 1973, to the attacks on him between 1977 up through the day of his assassination in March 1980, reveals how Romero was ultimately able to bridge, using Morelos' categories, the anti-secular, institutional, and committed sectors of Catholicism. Finding himself in a radically unequal society whose old order could no longer hold, Romero used his position as Archbishop to tap the moral and institutional power of the Catholic Church as a shield for the vulnerable. The downtrodden of El Salvador had endured more than 40 years of state violence and political repression. And unlike in Argentina, where the bishops who stayed in the country remained largely silent during the years of state terrorism, while committed Catholics worked with the poor in isolation from the church hierarchy, Romero demonstrated how a leader could maintain institutional authority while embracing a praxis of commitment to the least among us, attempting with all his might to avert his country's descent into civil war. Romero's assassination exposed a fault line that had been developing between Catholics since at least the Second Vatican Council. After 3 years of demonizing Romero, his murder revealed how the same Christian tradition could authorize diametrically opposed actions. How what we might term an archbishop's politically centrist attempt to hold society together by advocating for badly needed social and economic reforms, land reform, etc., as well as the dignity of those being brutally repressed, was construed as a subversive communist and a threat to Christianity itself. The impact of Romero's death, the commemoration of it, and the effort to contain its significance reverberated in local and transnational networks that were competing over the theological foundations of Christian practice. Whether the gospel demanded solidarity with the poor or defense of the existing social order, whether following Jesus meant dying for justice or killing to defend Christian civilization, whether the Eucharist called believers to share material goods or to preserve a sacred hierarchy. Christians on one side doubled down on legitimizing systematic violence, carried out with brutality by a U.S.-trained counterinsurgency battalion, while those on the other side condoned, if certain conditions were met, armed resistance to state terror and paramilitary violence. But to describe the 12-year conflagration, to say nothing of the murder of the Archbishop on the altar, as political violence fails to capture, I think, the beliefs about God and a properly ordered society that motivated the most important actors. Nor should it be described as religious violence, given that the Salvadoran state was not secular in any meaningful sense of the term, and that a distinction between religious and secular actors cannot be assumed in late Cold War El Salvador. The military itself broadcast on the armed forces radio station, quote, "We Salvadorans are Christians. We believe in Jesus. We believe in the resurrection. We believe that everything that happens is due to the will of God. Christianity is the main barrier that we have against atheistic Marxism," end quote. These are not the words of a secular state instrumentalizing religion, but rather of a counterinsurgency that understood itself to be fighting as much on a spiritual terrain as on a physical one. Given that theology was constitutive of the conflict on both sides, I propose the term theopolitical violence to describe the acts of violence against Romero specifically, as well as what drove the most important actors during the Civil War. In coining this term, I'm pointing to the ways that the theological and political were fused in the thinking and motivations of the military leaders, the agrarian oligarchy, in most of the bishops on the one hand, and in that of the revolutionaries on the other. They merged as well in the thinking of the centrists trying to implement reforms that could hold society together. 9 years before they torched a portrait of Óscar Romero, they killed him. On a Monday evening in March 1980, Archbishop Romero had just delivered his homily in the airy chapel of a hospital for the terminally ill. Blood welled from his ears and nose, his body limp on the polished floor. At around 2:30 a.m. on November 16, 1989, the soldiers killed 6 Jesuits. The military then killed 2 witnesses, the Jesuits' housekeeper, Elba Ramos, and her teenage daughter, Celina Ramos. With the scholar priest lying dead in their rose garden, the soldiers then torched an image of Romero. The glass of the picture frame melted and formed 2 enormous stalactites that hang down both sides of the portrait. Now it's a burnt, cracked, undulating print. The military attempted to kill the imago. The image was not death, but was instead a space in which life and death were commensurable, insofar as Romero was both known to be dead, and yet he needed to be killed again. The day after Romero was killed, Pope John Paul II described the sacrilegious assassination of Monsignor Óscar Romero, whose service as a priest of the Church has been sealed with the immolation of his life as he offered the Eucharistic sacrifice. Within the Vatican, the assassination of Romero was immediately compared to those of 2 other bishops killed in their churches, Thomas Becket of Canterbury in the year 1170, and Stanislaw of Krakow in the year 1079. Romero's death thus initiated a new phase in the theopolitical struggle. This one was fought not with bullets, but through the arcane processes of canonization, biographical construction, the transnational mobilization of supporters and opponents, as well as, crucially, theological interpretation. 3 years later, John Paul II issued Divinas Perfectionis Magister, pushing aside dozens of lay Italian lawyers whose livelihoods hinged upon the legal dialectics of saint-making. The 600-year-old tradition of the devil's advocate was gone. In its place, the Pope brought in historians and theologians, scholars concerned less with mutilating texts and more with understanding the truth and animating spirit of a person's life. But in the case of Romero, the deep theological and political divisions survived his death, and the meaning of that death was now a new front in the ongoing theopolitical battle. Of the 33 witnesses interviewed by diocesan postulators for the cause for the beatification of Romero, only one doubted the slain archbishop's fidelity to the Church, Bishop René Revello, one of the many prelates who had opposed him in life. Revello testified, quote, "People in general did not consider him, Romero, to be a martyr, but a victim of the country's political circumstances." End quote. Those who considered him a martyr had been ideologized. Revello insisted that Romero had been assassinated for political reasons, not in odium fidei. Revello's testimony crystallized the theological challenge at the heart of Romero's cause for beatification. That's the step before canonization. How to demonstrate that an archbishop killed by fellow Christians died in hatred of the faith. Doing so would implicitly acknowledge that the bishops who sabotaged Romero's pastoral leadership were acting against the faith they professed, and therefore the Church, which invested them with authority over their diocese and dozens of priests. In late 1996, Fathers Jesus Delgado, the diocesan postulator for the cause, and Vincenzo Paglia, the Roman postulator, hand-delivered an enormous sealed dossier to the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints. Across town, the Colombian Cardinal Alfonso López Trujillo was plotting to sink Romero's cause for sainthood. Soon after the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints began to work on the Roman phase of the cause, López Trujillo and Cardinal Darío Castrillón Hoyos successfully derailed it. Castrillón Hoyos was pro-prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy, and Cardinal López Trujillo headed the Pontifical Council on the Family. Together, the two revived the old accusation that Romero had been manipulated by the Jesuits. They had a powerful ally in their friend Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. In April 1997, the Congregation for the Clergy sent a letter to the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints. The Jesuit theologian John Sobrino, Cardinal Castrillón alleged, had constructed a fictitious person out of Romero, supplanting the real person. The question was whether, in life or in death, Romero had been used. Quote, although it does not seem that the good faith of the servant of God's intentions to defend the poor, the persecuted, and the oppressed can be doubted, it is nevertheless worth noting that he was instrumentalized in all of this, end quote, Cardinal Castrillón wrote. This was the same theological move that Ravelo had made, splitting Romero into authentic and manipulated doubles. In March 1998, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith froze Romero's cause. The full weight of the Roman Curia now legitimated the same interpretation of Christianity that had authorized violence against Romero and lay Catholics in the Christian-based communities. In the year 2000, as Cardinals López Trujillo and Castrillón Hoyos schemed about how to torpedo Romero's cause, John Paul II declared in an open-air mass in the Colosseum, quote, remember, O Father, of all the poor and marginalized, of all those who have borne witness to the truth and evangelical charity in America, to the point of giving their lives, selfless pastors like the unforgettable Archbishop Óscar Romero, killed on the altar during the celebration of the Eucharistic sacrifice, end quote. Then, less than 2 days before his renunciation, Pope Benedict XVI unblocked Romero's cause, sending it back from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, where it had been stalled for 12 years, to the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints. In October 2018, I accompanied thousands of Salvadoran pilgrims as Pope Francis intoned in St. Peter's Square, Óscar Arnulfo Romero Galdames, Archivescovo di San Salvador, Martire. The Church officially recognized Romero as a martyr and inscribed him into the communion of the saints. So, have I been arguing that far-right Christians and liberationists were two sides of the same coin? No, not at all. After the peace accords were signed, the UN Truth Commission found that 85% of human rights violations were committed by the state and right-wing death squads, and 5% by the guerrillas. 10% of the cases couldn't be determined. For rightists, salvation was tied to free market capitalism, and the violence dealt by the nation-state and its allied paramilitary forces was clothed in the language of defending a mythic Christian past. The soteriology of liberationists, by contrast, was tied to a critique of capitalist exploitation and state repression as sinful. Not all committed Catholics backed the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. Indeed, Romero and Ellacuría, one of the Jesuits killed in 1989, understood why the guerrillas were fighting, but never endorsed their means. My notion of theopolitical doppelgängers is not, in other words, a version of the dos demonios thesis, the sort of the two demons thesis. And I won't bore you with why it's thesis. But my argument has instead been that there is no ideal history of Christianity to which the faithful can appeal. Rather than tacitly accepting claims to authenticity, which both sides made through their competing interpretations of the same tradition, I focused on the material consequences of these two theological positions and on the relationships between believers, institutions, and practices. The assassination of Romero and the subsequent contestation of his legacy were thus manifestations of a transnational struggle that sought to preserve a specific vision of anti-egalitarian Christianity. The arguments deployed against Romero, the false prophet, the accusation that he was manipulated by Jesuits, the heresy of liberation theology, the inversion of idolatry as his accusers claimed he was self-deifying, transformed political disagreement into theopolitical justifications for violence. By branding Romero in this way, far-right Christians created the conditions under which his elimination became permissible in defense of the true faith. Bishop Revello testified that the Archbishop had been killed for his politics and not his faith. His entire attitude as Archbishop was always political, Revello argued, adding that Romero exceeded his evangelizing mission by straying into politics. A panel of 9 theological censors, as well as the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints and 3 popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, disagreed. Romero, the Church concluded, had been killed in hatred of the faith. Thanks. I think I went a little long, but thanks.
We still have some time for a Q&A if you're up for that.
Sure.
Great.
No.
I have a question. I mean, kind of the theopolitical argument you're making at the end that it became permissible, it almost seemed inevitable.
Yeah.
Do you feel that when you're piecing together this story and this framework, arguing against all that you're arguing, that moments are ratcheting together that martyrdom is inevitable in this case? Do you feel that?
I sort of do, yes. I mean, Ernesto Cardenal, or Rodolfo Cardenal, wrote a great biography of Rutilio Grande, and he wrote it right in the 80s when the Civil War is going on. And it's a big thing. But I think he did a very good job of showing how all of these attacks on Rutilio Grande had sort of created a permission structure for killing him. And that all of the symbolic violence was a prelude to direct physical violence. And I feel that, yes, in Romero, I point to Cardenal's biography because I don't think Romero's biographers have done a very good job of showing how this was sort of, the ground was prepared well in advance for his assassination. Yeah.
I have a related question to what you just said. Given the work that's been done on Romero, which is considerable, and you looking at materials on your own, what have you discovered that contributes to or adds to what we know about that conversion period that Romero went through? Were these things that Romero wrote about in his own materials? Is this something that we just know happened because his public notes on happenings was made public? Do we know much about that conversion, that turmoil that led him to side with a completely different political group, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, theologians have done a fantastic job on this topic, on Romero's conversion.
I would think there's more on this than almost anything, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're right. It is it's the question.
Yeah.
And it's the reason that we are attracted to Romero, I think, because how did this guy... It's different, right? If you're sort of... You never change. It's almost boring.
Born perfect.
Right, yeah, you're born perfect, exactly. But this is a person who had the openness to interpret his reality and change his mind and realize he is wrong. He had made mistakes. And so initially there was... John Sobrino kind of gets accused by the Vatican of distorting the legacy, the Romero in some ways. And one of the things that people criticized Sobrino for was that he gives us a sort of road to Damascus conversion. Rutilio Grande is killed in 1977. Overnight, Romero is sort of, before the dead body of Rutilio, Romero is converted. But I think many historians, including the first Jesuit biographer of Romero, James Brockman, and then Roberto Morozzo della Rocca, an Italian historian who ends up writing the Positio, the big document that's used for beatification, he debunked that. Like they and then a couple of Salvadoran priests wrote about an earlier period when Romero was he was a bishop in Santiago de Maria, serving poor people. A number of people were killed in his community, in a community he was the pastor for, and he internally disagrees with the military and asks for an investigation. He wasn't ready to come public with his opposition to this, but you can see then that. And so I would just say that in reading the diaries, I think the process begins much earlier than even we thought, or even these great historians and theologians have said. I think it's starting in 1966, and it keeps going. But it's we see in 1973 he's attacking the Jesuits. Like, he's not finished converting himself. He's still trying. Like, but you see in Romero a person who is reading the documents of Vatican II, who is reading the documents from Medellin, and he was trying to understand them, and he was willing to be changed by them, to be changed by ideas and by reality.
Thanks.
Kevin, I have a question about the criticism on the Jesuits, and was there ever any evidence that the Jesuits were actually teaching like Marxist theory, or did they take the example of bringing students out to the neighborhoods to see and witness poverty and to learn and use that as a way to label them as Marxists, or was there actual like legitimacy that they were teaching political something new in a religious setting?
Yeah, absolutely. They were teaching classic texts, and they saw, they were serious intellectuals. These guys, they had PhDs from Germany, from Spain, from the University of Chicago's Divinity School. These people they wanted to understand social reality, and to do that, you need some tools. And so they were giving their students, they were giving them little passages and stuff from Marx and from Sartre and from, as well as church documents. And then they were having their students go out and do surveys in these communities. And the kids were finding out that, they'd been raised in a bubble. And so, the Jesuits defend themselves, and you almost feel sorry for them because they were so sincere, but they defend themselves in this series of, I don't know, it may have been 6, but these series of 6 long explanations of their pedagogy. And it's really great to read, that they're very sophisticated theological, sociopolitical arguments, and they didn't back down, but which, does that answer your question?
No, it does, because I didn't quite understand that piece of it, whether or not they were actually, as you said, sociologists were the ones who were the most targeted, but was it pervasive throughout, or was it some sociologists teaching social theory and Marxism was one theory that they were teaching among many theories? Or was it actually bent towards using Marxist theory to understand the political situation in El Salvador?
Great question. I think that it was the first thing that you said, that it was, we're also going to read a little Adam Smith, it was we're exposing you to classic texts.
Okay.
That's how I understand it. In my understanding of it comes from the Jesuits' defense of it, and from the newspaper accounts at the time. And in the newspaper accounts at the time, too, it's clear that they are reading Sartre, they are reading Marx, but they're also, I think, reading Adam Smith and that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Can I ask, what was going on with the government? Why were they killing so many people? And might that explain the conversion? He was seeing something on the ground. And I mean, it's implicit in what your presentation. I don't know the background exactly.
Yeah.
Was there something specific that the government was targeting in their what you're describing as almost mass murders, the death squads? And might that be the obvious answer as to what converted him? He was seeing something horrendous in front of him.
Yeah.
What was the basis of the death squads? What were they going after? Was it purely communism? And was it just a traditional fight between the right and the left in Central America and South America at the time? Is that what was going on?
So, El Salvador, in 1932, there's a massive massacre of indigenous people, some 10,000, mostly indigenous people. There were elections. The Communist Party of El Salvador had won a few of these mayoral elections in small villages like you guys served in Peace Corps, right? 1,000 people or something. Anyway, in like 5 or 6 of these small towns, the Communist Party candidate won. The military didn't like it. They stepped in and then and installed their own preferred candidates for mayors of these towns. And then the people rose up and they committed a few symbolic killings of the person, say, that had been put in as the stooge in the stolen election. But they were sort of very targeted. 5, 6, 7, 8, 17 people killed, something like that. The military responds, General Hernandez Martinez responds with this mass murder of some 10,000 people. That sets up what some historians have called a scar of memory. And from that point on, El Salvador is governed by a military regime. By the 70s, they're cloaking it in elections, but these are rigged elections. So it's even then you had to sort of make a gesture toward democracy in the late Cold War, but it was still a military regime. Romero was not uncomfortable with it for most of his life. He was fine with it for most of his life. It's in 70s, and so yes, part of it. And Roberto Morozzo, this historian that I referenced, his explanation is that when Romero is elevated to archbishop, he has now responsibility for defending these priests and the faithful in his community. And that's what leads him to convert or be more outspoken. I think Morozzo is generally right about that. But I don't think it's enough to explain it, because if you look at the Argentine case that Gustavo Morello studies, most of these bishops did not speak out. And the number of people being killed in Argentina was significant. So just to very briefly, Romero's killed, and then some 70,000 people are killed in the Salvadoran Civil War before the peace accords are negotiated in 1992. So it opened the door to even more, because the centrists who were trying to implement some reforms to let the pressure out got killed off.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a question. I'm a visiting researcher from Germany in Catholic dogmatics, and I have a question regarding the relation of German discourse, we say old political theology from Carl Schmitt and new political theology. It's close to liberation theology by Johann Baptist Metz. So, and I'm asking myself, those two concepts, they are responses to modernity, and they would claim from each other we have nothing in common, but they have the same name, like they label political theology or the new one. So I'm asking myself, maybe there's a long distance relationship between these terms. For example, like the very apocalyptic tendency, or when you read Carl Schmitt, there's this leitmotif of exception. We have to act now. It's very like the decision is the most important thing here.
Yes.
And so he's sacralizing sovereignty.
Yes.
And Carl Schmitt is speaking of radical, like this idea of memoria passionis.
Yeah.
So, what do you think of that? Because I'm out of my dogmatic perspective. I'm, it strikes me. Also, the German word doppelgänger.
Yes.
Of these concepts.
Yes.
Yeah. So, what do you think of that? Of the relationship?
I think you're right on. Your intuition is right there. My sense of it is that there is no pure tradition to appeal to, but both want to appeal to some pure tradition, and that ultimately sets up a collision, a sort of a pole. There's no way to get out of it, right? If you ultimately have an indisputable claim to the truth, why give it up? So that's why I said. That's why I feel like we can. For at least for me, I'm not a theologian, so but for me, it needs to be a category of analysis that historians are using, and not political theology as a normative claim, or say Luke Brotherton or other theologians are making arguments about political theology for a kind of Christianity in a plural society for the commons, to build our common lives together. That's one project, it's a great project for theologians to undertake. My sense is that we need this term to understand reality, and here's an example. So you're right. Schmitt famously says, the modern state secularizes theological concepts. Nayib Bukele, last week at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C. So Nayib Bukele is the president of El Salvador. He is wildly popular throughout in El Salvador, 70, 80, 90% approval ratings. In Latin America, he's the most popular president in Latin America. He's also an authoritarian and a dictator. So he has changed the Constitution, etc. But I'll get to the political theology here. I just wanted to give that background. He goes before in the National Prayer Breakfast, he says to everyone, El Salvador used to be the murder capital of the world. Now it's one of the safest countries in the world. How did we do it? We did it we won the spiritual war first, and then we won the physical war. That's one example. So in my view, Bukele is the opposite. He's the opposite of Schmitt. He is theologizing secular concepts. And here's another example of how I think Bukele is doing this. In February 2022, he's newly elected. He has gang violence is an enormous problem in El Salvador. People are rightly wanting safety and security. He's elected on this. Partly. He has what they call the Plan Control Territorial. He wants to control gang violence. He asked the Salvadoran legislature for $109 million, and they're not willing to give it to him. And the Salvadoran legislature is made up of mainly of two political parties: Arena, a far-right party that comes out of the intellectual author of the assassination of Romero, Roberto Loizon, is the founder of Arena in the early 1980s. They govern for 20 years. Gang violence explodes under them. It's a sort of neoliberal kind of government, privatization, etc. But they hollow out the state. The state can no longer care for its citizens. They eventually, the FMLN, the old guerrilla group, becomes a official political party after '92, after the peace accords. they run for 8 years and they govern for 8 years. They can't get the gang thing under control either. Bukele comes as an outsider. He was from the FMLN, but he comes from the outsider and he flips hard to the right. Wins on the promise of fixing the gang problem. Parliament says, no, we're not going to give you $109 million. He takes away all their security detail. He puts snipers on the roof. He goes into the legislature with heavily armed military, soldiers and police. He sits in the chair of the president of the National Assembly, right? So he physically, if we want to think it's really in terms, he physically takes the place of that secular sovereign, right? In the laws that we, and the norms that we use to make decisions in our societies, he takes the place of it. And he sits for 3 minutes and prays. At the end of the 3 minutes of praying, I was speaking with God. God has told me to be patient. So it's a threat, right? It's an implicit threat that I will use violence against you guys if you don't give me what I want. And then he goes out. The pact with the gangs breaks down a few weeks later in March 2022. Over just 3 days, some 82 people are killed in very brutal ways, in very visible ways, on like the road to the luxurious resort on the beach, at the beach, right? And none of those 83 victims are gang members. And so the gangs were sending a signal to Bukele, hey, you broke the deal. Your plan territorial that was reducing violence, it's not been reducing violence at all because of your plan. It's because we held back. We can kill whenever we want. And so then that same day, that same weekend, March, I don't know the date, 17th, 2022, he institutes a state of exception that suspends, this is in Schmittian terms, he suspends the rule of law. He is the one who can decide when the law should be obeyed and when it shouldn't. He suspends all civil liberties and guarantees, and then the legislature renews it every single month since. It's been 4 years. And now we're the safest country in the world, safest, whatever. Now the murder rate is like 1.9 per 100,000. Before it was like 100 per 100,000, so it's really like, but he's locking up anyone with a tattoo. So I think when he talks about spiritual warfare, I want to try and understand it. Like, and this is, yeah.
Kind of building on that, I'm curious, does he reference Óscar Romero at all in his discussions? And I was part of a group with Ben here, a student. We just went to El Salvador in January. And so I'm just curious, like from 2018 till now, what do you see is changing in terms of Romero's, the way he's honored and remembered, and do you see Bukele's government incorporating him or talking about him? Or
a friend of ours, Carlos Colorado, says that Bukele can't completely discard Romero. Like, Romero's too powerful a figure still in Salvadoran memory that he has to. So there's a portrait of Romero in the Casa Presidencial. He can't take that down. The airport is named after Óscar Romero. He hasn't renamed the airport. He doesn't invoke Romero. It's Romero is there. He's, as you may know from when you were visiting, like, he's still a very important figure in the base communities. He's still, the murals and the folk songs and the going to the cathedral is still very important for a number of Catholics in El Salvador. But this is crucial. In 1980, when Romero's killed, 5% of the population of El Salvador was Protestant. 95%-ish, well, I don't know, they were probably unaffiliated and agnostics and atheists, whatever. But the rest, pretty much, were Catholic. Now, they're at parity. right? So the physical violence that of counterinsurgency was directed at progressive Christians, progressive Catholics, and there weren't enough. In Salvador, it's different from Brazil, where there was a larger population of Protestants in the 80s. But it was directed very much at progressive, liberationist Catholics, and the counterinsurgency did support the evangelical Protestant.
I have a question. It's a little bit unrelated to that, but I'm also going to El Salvador next week. I'm in a course about it, so I'm kind of thinking about this a little bit. So, just with Romero's canonization, do you have any insight into like whether it was kind of like a political move to move towards canonizing him when that happened after having that kind of on the back burner for so long? I've been reading just a couple things like, okay, maybe like the agendas of certain popes and like the sorts of saints that they were canonizing. So do you have any insight into like why Romero's canonization was relevant at the moment that it happened?
I think it would be, so the short answer is Francis, but it's not all Francis, right? Because John Paul II basically starts to give the green light in that, where I told in the Colosseum, he invokes Romero, even though he's being attacked by this very conservative cardinal, López Trujillo. And then Benedict unblocks the cause at the end. And that's also very important. So Francis could not have canonized Romero had John Paul II not claimed Romero for the church, and had Benedict not unblocked the cause. Well, I suppose Francis could have unblocked the cause, but it wouldn't have helped Romero for us if Francis did all of it, because there was enough sort of like, that Francis was liberationist or whatever. But it's very important to note that this traditionalist pope unblocked Romero's cause. And yes, I mean, the church needed Romero. So Francis says, all right, let's go to the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints. And I think for Francis and for many Catholics in Latin America and in North America, Romero is such an important figure that they moved quickly on that after unblocking it.
Well, what was the U.S.'s...
This will be the last question.
Okay, what was the U.S.'s position on support during the whole affair? Did it kind of swing back and forth?
You mean support for the cause on Romero or in the Civil War?
Kind of both. To like, where were they supporting? Were they supporting Romero or the church at the time of the governments, or the different factions, or was it broken up as well?
There was the U.S. government position was not as supportive as it should. Romero famously begs Carter to cut off military aid, and Carter doesn't. They called it non-lethal aid or something at some point, but we were still arming, training these soldiers that were cutting down peasants and priests and students. On the cause, I don't know, but the solidarity groups at places like Boston College and other places were very important to this whole thing. There were solidarity groups that were supporting people in El Salvador throughout the Civil War and after, and they played a crucial role in educating our fellow citizens about U.S. policy in Central America, and in making visible the human rights abuses that were going on there in our names, and opposing them.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Kevin Coleman.
Thank you, guys.